Sam Seder, Emma Vigland on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program Milton Allimadi. He is an author, journalist, professor, and co-founder of Black Star News. In Milton, it is Michael Brooks's birthday.
Yes.
You were one of his favorite guests. And we've been trying to sort of like, I don't know, do what Michael would be doing, or
Right.
at least, be talking about some of the things on his birthday. One of the things that he had, that he really brought to the show, broadly speaking, was a wealth of knowledge when it came to foreign policy, but also a real knowledge base and curiosity of what was happening in the global South,
Yes.
and in particularly, throughout Africa. And you were one of his, primary sources of information. So really appreciate your coming on today.
Thank you.
And in that spirit, we'd ask you, what do you think he would want to be talking about? What would he be following today? And one of those things you had mentioned was France's complete withdrawal from West Africa. Tell us a little bit about that and the relevance. And then maybe we can get into also what's happening in the wake of USAID coming out,
Right.
and what your thoughts are on that.
Okay, very good. All right, so I think when we had our first conversation about Africa, West Africa, it was focused on Burkina Faso. He was a huge fan of the late Thomas Sankara. And me too, by the way. So I think today he would be impressed to see that there is a resurgence of the spirit of Sankara, wanting to take control of the destiny of African countries, wanting to kick out French neocolonialism. French neocolonialism was very special relative to the colonial experience in Africa. So when you compare with Britain, for example, the British withdrew, they relinquished control over the finances. Of course, they could still control it in a different way. Now they could rely on the World Bank and the IMF.
Right.
But France, in addition to the World Bank and the IMF, tied the currencies of the West African countries to the French franc. And it tied it in a very peculiar way. They were required to keep a portion, at one point it was 50% of their reserves in the French central bank, meaning France was pretty much managing the economies because France was investing that surplus fund. And if it made money for them, good. If it lost, too bad, right? So that's how dominant France was. And of course, the French also had military garrisons in those former West African colonies. And that's why it's even hard to, all of these countries generally, when you talk about independence, it's very superficial. They have their own national anthem, they have their flags, they have their state house, they have their president, they have all the symbols of statehood, but they don't really have sovereignty, generally speaking, even for the former British colonies, as I said. But add to that what I just factored in with the French arrangement. So you can now understand why the French presence is so widely resented, even by other African countries that were not former French colonies. So when Thomas Sankara came on the stage in 1983, it was quite remarkable. Here is somebody in a former French colony where neocolonialism is so dominant, coming into power and taking, what we can actually do for ourselves. We can run our own country. We can produce our own food. Why are we importing bottled water, for example? And he instituted agrarian reform. The land was made widely available to people that previously did not own land. Production grew within 3 years. Burkina Faso became self-sufficient in food. So obviously France did not like this example that Sankara was setting and made it its mission to eliminate Sankara using the leader at the time of neighboring Ivory Coast, Felix Houphouët-Boigny, a very tightly controlled neocolonial leader. So then Sankara was off the stage. And now you see this resurgence. You see the current leader, Ibrahim Traore, evoking the spirit, memory, and the practice of Sankara. You see it being duplicated in Mali as well, and in Niger. So this is a conversation that I'm sure Michael would really enjoy exchanging with me.
And I mean, what is leading to the? Is it that the French are being pressured out, or
Yes.
is it simply like the French don't have the resources or reorienting, or is it a little bit of both?
A little bit of both. And that's a very good question, actually. I think France, obviously by virtue of being a member of NATO, by having a strong relationship with the United States, was able to project beyond its power militarily on the African continent. I think that is no longer the case. I think, for example, when you had the coup in Niger, the US had built a couple of years ago a $100 million drone base in Niger. So when the new government, the military government came in Niger, gave France an ultimatum, you have to leave by such and such a date. You've been exploiting our uranium. We're going to ban further exports until we come up with an arrangement that benefits us financially. So the US, with France, they're normally on the same page on issues like that. But the US realized, wait a minute, we need to speak a different language with them in case they allow us to remain and keep our drone base. So the US actually ended up staying an additional several more months while Niger was considering. And then Niger came to the conclusion that, no, US, you have to go as well. So generally speaking, in the past, France was able to flex more muscles than it really had because of US support. So that has made it much more difficult. And plus, I think the young people are much more aware now and much less willing of being exploited by the French. Unlike the older generation, where we had a few, they would handpick the bourgeois African leaders to support, and those leaders would be able to maintain solid control with French military support. But the young people are now showing that they're willing to come out on the streets and protest much more vigorously. And France obviously does not want to be seen supporting a government that is shooting down its own citizens.
How does that history or that understanding with young people translate to other countries now trying to invest in African countries, particularly China, as well as it builds out infrastructure across the continent? I'm curious if there's that same skepticism, rightful skepticism that carries over now.
Okay, so when we come to China, China has a very unique relationship with Africa because, as you pointed out, China has built a lot. In fact, the African Union headquarters, for example, in Addis Ababa, that was built by China. Mm-hmm. A lot of the impressive roads, highways in Addis Ababa, built by China. The bridges, the railways, it's invested a lot in rail, something which the West has not been willing to do.
I was there 26 years ago in Addis Ababa, and everyone was talking about how the Chinese were investing there.
Yes, absolutely. But of course, that also comes with a cost. They're not doing this for free. This is not the China of Chairman Mao. No, this is a very different China. The China of Chairman Mao built that great railway connecting Tanzania to Zambia, for example, call it the Tanzania-Zambia Railway. That was done much in the spirit of solidarity, because when they started working out that relationship, China was not a member of the United Nations yet. That we had Taiwan. So China needed a lot of African support and solidarity in order to get seated at the UN. Eventually that happened. And of course, now China is part of the a permanent member of the Security Council. But the China that we have today is very much market-oriented China. So China comes and builds all these roads, but of course, in return, they want either payment or they want a significant stake in your mineral resources. So the young people are now questioning that relationship as well with China. Why are we mortgaging our resources for such a long period of time. So you have younger leaders. In the case of the military leaders in Niger, in Burkina Faso, in Mali, they know that, okay, once you kick out the French, you're going to need an alternative. So for that, right now, that's why they were building this tighter relationship with Russia. Not so much that they have a particular love for Russia, but if Russia can give them military support to withstand any possible aggression from France, they're going to take that. But then you have the case of a leader like Bassirou Faye in Senegal, who is a civilian, but came to power because of a young activist who came out in the street when France wanted Macky Sall, who had served 2 terms, but had a very neocolonial relationship that France was happy with. They wanted to support him to even extend into a 3rd term, even though it was banned by the Constitution. That's when the young people came out on the street, led by people like Bassirou Faye, and ultimately forced them to have elections, which Bassirou Faye's party won. So now he is trying to play off the Chinese relationship with the West, with the United States, with France. So that's the kind of tightrope that he's walking in terms of the difference between his approach and the approach of the leaders in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. But ultimately, the young people are also questioning the neocolonial control that the World Bank and the IMF has over African countries. I think the best example of that was what we saw in Kenya last year, when the government wanted to hike taxes because it wanted to increase its capacity to pay the World Bank and IMF loans. And the young people are saying, we're already being bled really to death. We can't afford to pay anymore. And the taxes were on items that you cannot live without: food, fuel, and housing. So they organized on social media. It was very powerful, very effective. They forced the government to cancel those taxes. It came at a cost, of course. At one time, the government, just seemed to lose control, and young people are being shot at with live ammunition. I think more than 50 were killed, but ultimately they succeeded. So that is the kind of change that we're seeing in the African continent right now, where young people are becoming much more vigorous in challenging the neocolonial status quo.
And France seems to have they get a little white knuckled about this stuff. It feels like. I mean, I think I have never been able to get over their claim on Haiti's,
Right.
gross national product up until, and people I don't think realize this, Haiti had to pay back France the cost of freeing themselves as slaves until, what was it, like 1950?
Absolutely.
And maybe it was 1948 or something like that, but that's 100 and, I don't know, I can't do the math, 150 years or so.
Absolutely.
And that sets a country back a little bit. If you lose 150 years of essentially compounding interest in being able to reinvest your resources.
Absolutely. And that's a tragedy.
A huge tragedy. And France was sort of like, really, they had their grip was the last on some level to go, at least from that era of colonialism.
Yeah. And of course, the Haitian Revolution, you don't want something like that to spread. That is not a good example to be to allow to spread in places where Africans were still enslaved. So that was part of the reason that, okay, even though they kicked us out physically, militarily, we still have ways to make them pay the price and to set an example to other places where Africans may want to emulate or duplicate what the Haitian people did. And also it goes with the whole spirit of, how dare you deprive the ruling planter class of their assets, of their property. That is not a good example as well. So a lot of people were not aware until recently, because now in recent years it's been the news, that after the slavery was abolished in Britain in 18, when was it? Was it 1883?
Slavery was earlier than that in Britain. I believe it was like 1830.
Yeah, somebody looked it up. I thought it was like 1883. But anyway, after they abolished, they compensated the former enslavers. Those were the ones who are compensated, not the formerly enslaved, you see? So it was consistent with what France was doing as well.
Yep.
How dare you deprive us of our assets? The amount that Britain compensated the former enslavers, if you do it, let's say in 2024 US currency, it will come more than $2 billion. That's how much they were compensated, you see? So it goes with that whole mentality that you are not entitled to your liberty and to deprive us of our income, which we're entitled to from your sweat and blood.
So it was 1834. I knew it was before the states got to it.
Yeah,
but,
I mixed it around by putting 83. I was going to say 38, something like that. But yeah, thank you for that.
What are the implications of the aid cuts that we've seen from, obviously from the Trump administration is basically all but abolished USAID. And what's your perspective on USAID? Because there's sort of it is another mechanism of control on some level, but also it saved a certain amount of lives.
Absolutely. And that is the catch-22, and that is the tragedy. Of course, the tragedy is for the neo-colonial, bougie, African elite leadership that emerged after independence to allow themselves to develop that kind of dependency with the World Bank, with the IMF, and with these institutions. The British have their versions of these institutions as well that have made African countries so dependent on these quote unquote aid organizations. So you have a situation where now, and I'm not saying it's directly tied to USAID per se, but you have African countries that have abundant fertile land. And yet, on an annual basis, Africa imports $35 billion worth of food. That is preposterous. They've never been this food dependent since even the 1960s. In the 1960s, they used to grow much more of their food than they import today. So in a roundabout way, to answer your question, I'm saying in the short run, it is going to be devastating, of course. In countries like South Africa, for example, that depended on a very significant amount of that money to support their healthcare program, the fight against HIV/AIDS. A lot of people that won't have access to the medicines are going to die, So obviously, nobody can support that kind of unilateral overnight cut, right? This is something that should be phased out, but definitely should be phased out so that these countries can develop their own capacities because they have the natural resources. They have the natural resources to generate wealth from that and get away from this dependency. And that also applies to the economies, for example. So you have today in 2025, the same structure that was created and established in 1884-85 at the infamous Berlin Conference, when African countries were partitioned by the European powers. What did they set up? They own the territory. So it's like a new form of slavery, in fact. They own the territory, they control the population, they impose subjugated labor upon them, they take away their land, so now they don't have independent income to be independent because they're now dependent on working on the people that are now taking over their land. They produce raw materials that are shipped off to those European countries that have now industrialized. They manufacture products that they bring it back to African countries. So they have a captive market. The Africans have no choice but to buy those manufactured products from Europe. 2025, we have the same arrangement. There's not a single industrialized African country, right? So the Europeans don't even have to be physically in control anymore. You have the World Bank and the IMF.
Right.
You want to get a loan from them, they're going to give you conditions which preclude industrialization. So it's 2025, you're still selling raw materials.
How explicitly do they preclude it? I mean, is it explicit or is it just that they put constraints on capital investments?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, they can't come and say, you can't take this money and put it in this and that. So they use a so-called free market, right? They talk about the free market as if we even have the free market here in the United States, right?
Right.
So they say you should put the money into the, what do they call it? What you have a comparative advantage in, right? And obviously your comparative advantage is not producing cars, right? You should import that from the US or Britain or from European countries. Your comparative advantage in producing raw materials. And that's the argument they make,
And that's the constraints they put on the loans, essentially.
On the loans, essentially. And that's only half of it. And then the other half is, and this has been referred to as structural adjustment. Also, we don't want wasteful spending. So you have to lay off civil servants. You have to lay off teachers. You have to stop subsidizing education. You have to stop subsidizing healthcare. There's an interesting documentary. It's called "The End of Poverty," with a question mark. It's pretty old, like 20 years. It needs to be updated. But I mean, do you have Africans being interviewed describing the impact of these conditionalities? People dying of simple malaria. Because now when you go to a health clinic, if you don't pay cash, you won't have access to quinine and basic medication that would save your life. That is just one of the types of impacts. You have people that have been kicked out of school now because they have to pay now because the government is not subsidizing education.
It's fascinating stuff. Milton, we could continue this conversation, and there's a lot other things too. I think that we could be talking about. We have to move on, but let's do this again soon.
Thank you for the opportunity, and we love Michael, and we miss Michael, and may he rest with the ancestors in peace.
Indeed. And we will put links to some of the past interviews and conversations that you had with Michael on TMBS in our podcast and YouTube description. Again, Milton, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Be well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good to see you, Milton.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.